Hi, everybody. Welcome. Today we have Greg Duff, principal with Foster Garvey out of the Seattle office. Greg is chair of the Hospitality Travel and Tourism Group. The hospitality travel and tourism practice is dedicated to hotels, restaurants, tour operators, cruise companies, airlines, and industry associations. Greg has over 25 years in the lodging industry, experience as former in-house roles with Starwood, Webvan.com, and Columbia Hospitality, and he has been a longtime associate of HospitalityLawyer.com, presenting at many of our conferences. Today, Greg is going to talk to you about COVID-19 communications, necessary changes in guest communications. And I'll hand it over to Greg.
Thank you, Taylor. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everyone, even if virtually. A huge thanks to Taylor and Stephen and the entire Hospitality Law Group. Appreciate the many years that we've enjoyed working with them all and being a part of these annual programs. Obviously, we're a little bit different these days working virtually, but nonetheless, we are very, very happy and proud to be a part of the program for so many years. As the title slide talked about and as Taylor introduced, we're going to be talking about communications. And I know so many of the presentations this year are on COVID. I felt it necessary to join that theme. But really focusing on some very basics. And you may wonder, well, why is a lawyer speaking to these topics? Shouldn't we be talking to the PR team or the sales team or what have you? All of that is true. But at the same time, there are issues that we are being asked as counsel to many of our clients about trying to, as this title slide or this slide indicates, strike a balance between what we sometimes see as two competing concerns. So the first point, alleviating guest concerns in personal health and safety, as probably all of you are very familiar with by now, those that have watched the incredible downturn in the travel industry generally, and whether that be individual leisure travel, whether that be group or corporate travel, one message has been clear, is that in really the only way in which travel will resume as we once knew it is to provide our guests the certainty, if you will, or assurances around their own personal health and safety. And until we get there, we shouldn't expect things to be back to normal, however we choose to define that going forward. I recognize that a lot of this is out of our collective control, whether it be vaccines, whether it be the distribution of vaccines, whether it be therapeutic type responses, whatever it may be, many of those are far outside of our control, and we are simply left to deal with whatever timeline those things actually occur. At the same time, though, as we will talk about in going through these slides quickly today, is that some of this is not necessarily out of our control, particularly how we choose to respond to changes, and in particular for this presentation, how we communicate them. The competing interests against this need to alleviate or assuage guest concerns relates to important disclosure requirements. As we all know, the pandemic has been a moving target in terms of the stage of the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic, frankly, the advice we've been given about how best to respond to the pandemic. That changes today as early as this morning, and how many government officials, healthcare organizations, et cetera, have chosen to respond to the pandemic has also changed. And so from a lawyer or legal perspective, as the world is changing, it's important for us as we work, whether as outside counsel or in-house counsel, to respond to those things in a couple of important ways, which we're going to be talking about. And in doing so, it is our goal to do what we can or advise our clients as best they can, how to minimize potential liability that might be falling out of or following the pandemic and its effects. So next slide, Taylor. So as I said at the outset, or I questioned at the outset, isn't this a program better presented from a PR or sales perspective? The short answer is yes, to some degree. So in preparing the program today, I reached out to one of the PR firms that we have worked with frequently with several of our clients to get their perspective on, from a guest service, guest-oriented approach to communications, what are the most important points to stress in terms of how we improve the effectiveness of those communications, keeping that end goal in mind of alleviating guest concerns about their personal health and safety. And so you can see here from the list of those things that from a PR perspective were recommended. Obviously, as you can see from this list, the campaign, if you will, or the response to the pandemic shouldn't necessarily be something that has never occurred before or is something dissimilar from what the organization otherwise stands for. And what I mean by that is, yes, the pandemic may be new, but the values that the company or the client or whatever it may be, the organization, the hotel, the resort, the restaurant, the values of that company, the values of that brand, the response to the pandemic should be, it should embody those values, but also it should be an extension of those values. And as you see from my last point here, in terms of highlighting the experience and historical commitment, again, this shouldn't be entirely new. Particularly with pandemics, we've had some experiences with them in the past, obviously not to this degree, but nonetheless, for many of our global clients who have properties around the world, they've seen pandemics before, they've been forced to respond to pandemics before. And so one of the clear messages from a PR perspective should be, this isn't the first time we've seen this. Yes, its effects are perhaps broader and more significant, particularly here in North America. But we as an organization have been built around responding to these types of things. We have plans and practices in place. And our response to this pandemic is going to be a continuation and representative of those established practices and policies. So again, we're not creating something from scratch here. Yes, there may be nuances that are new, but nonetheless, it should be part of the same orientation, guest orientation that we as an organization have already had. Next slide, please. So from a legal perspective, our work has fallen out typically in two different categories. So from that first paragraph there, or that first point, excuse me, our goal is to manage, or if you will, reset guest expectations as to what they should expect when they travel with us, when they stay with us, or when they eat with us. And as I said, we typically see this in two different categories. The first relates to practices and policies. Those are probably pretty self-evident, but what policies or practices is your organization requiring with respect to the wearing of masks, social distancing protocols and practices, questionnaires or health questionnaires or interviews upon arrival at the property, elevator policies? Yes, believe it or not, many organizations have new elevator policies about the number of people and families, et cetera, that may ride in an elevator. All of these things fall on the policies and practices side of the equation. And on the other side, I have here amenities. And what I simply mean by that is today, as you travel and visit properties, depending on where, but for the most part, many of the amenities or the facilities that you might come to expect from a hotel or resort or even a restaurant, many of those facilities and amenities are either not operating, they're currently closed, and that may be because of COVID requirements, or it could be just the economic realities following from COVID. But many of those facilities and amenities are either not opening, or their hours or their services have been curtailed. And so in terms of managing guest expectations, you want to set the table as to what to expect in terms of the practices when you arrive, but also many of the amenities and facilities that you as a guest may have come to expect from a resort or hotel like ours, or frankly from a prior stay with us, that may be different. And so it's important to communicate that. The second point here is communicate early and often. And what I mean by that is the earlier you can communicate this information, the earlier you can set those expectations, the better. Now, this point raises or brings into question the age-old issue about at what point is the guest contract from a hotel perspective, or frankly from an airline or cruise perspective, at what point is that contract established? And because of that, and because of sometimes the uncertainties around that, we advise that the earlier you can communicate these practices and policies, and the earlier you can tell people what to expect in terms of facilities and amenities, the better. And not only must you do that early, but we also recommend you do that often. And we're going to talk in a moment what that might look like practically, but it's important to communicate that message frequently. Next point here is in terms of updating. And as I mentioned in the prior slide, we all know that not only has the pandemic changed over time, but so has the response to that. And again, whether that be the WHO, whether that be the CDC, whether it be the White House, whether it be the Institute of Health, frankly, or whether it's state health agencies, county health agencies, or even in some circumstances, city, it's changing often and evolving. And so just because a statement today may be accurate about what practice or policy may be in place, or what hours your restaurant may be opened, that can change very quickly. And so as that changes, we encourage people to have at least the means by which they can update and do update those things quickly. Fourth point here is relying on authorities. Obviously, many of us, or I would say, venture to guess, most of us in the travel industry or hospitality industry are not healthcare experts. There is an important role to be played by healthcare experts here. And our advice has generally been, to the extent you can, rely on the directions you are receiving by local authorities to establish a baseline. And then if you choose to go above that, that's great. Do so cautiously, my final point here. But nonetheless, feel free to rely on those authorities. And when questioned by guests or travelers or passengers or customers, you have something to fall back to and point to, so that you are not out there alone instituting something that may not be well received. My final point here, which is true with frankly any policy or practice or any communication, don't overpromise. Don't, obviously in this pandemic era, don't promise guests that under no circumstances would they ever contract COVID while on your property. You may take every precaution, you may take every mitigation effort or activity possible, but at the end of the day, there's too much unknown to ever make that kind of commitment. So no surprise here, don't overpromise. Next slide. So practically speaking, one of the things that many of our guests have, many of our clients have asked of us is, given the broad principles, Greg, that you've outlined about communications, how do we best effectuate those with the various points at which we touch our guests, or where we communicate with our guests? And one of the best examples of this is the booking path. And what I mean by that is, and I'm going to focus here on for a moment the online booking path, and I'm assuming that we're working with the proprietary website or what have you, brand.com. How do we best communicate and ensure that we're communicating appropriately throughout this path? And so again, going back to what do we need to communicate? We typically recommend a handful of things. One, obviously, as I said earlier, what the practices and policies of the property may be. 2, changes to amenities or facilities. 3, an acknowledgement or statement that the description of practices and policies and amenities and facilities may change frequently, and provide a mechanism by which guests or customers or travelers can get updated information. That may be either revisit our website often. That may be if you had particular questions about the current practices, feel free to call us. It may be simply links to websites from the CDC or local authorities that will provide travelers even more information. So where do you put this information, or how do you display this information? So typically what we recommend is, and again, focusing on the online booking path, you'll see here we've listed the various touch points that might occur during the booking process. So as early on as the website, when someone types in brand.com to start their search or to start their booking process, we recommend that very early on there is some statement that talks about the items I listed for you. It doesn't necessarily need to be in great detail. And what we're finding is that clients generally start quite broad in their description of changes. So maybe that's the first statement from the company's CEO. It's the first statement from a company-wide health officer, whatever it may be. Start broad. And then as the communications dial in and get closer to the actual booking decision, and then the arrival of the guest, those communications need to become more specific. So again, looking at the various touch points, the website, obviously a good place to start. When someone selects a particular destination, a particular property type, a particular booking date, length of stay, or what have you, When the property description is made available, again, there, provide information. And in that instance, you may be able to provide specific information for that particular property. Booking terms and conditions, many now, whether it be a cancellation policy or what have you, will require of a guest to acknowledge their review of those booking conditions and acceptance. We have suggested to several clients that they may want to include some pandemic-related references as part of those. The confirmatory email or whatever it may be that you send following the booking is also a great opportunity to reiterate those same practices, policies, and amenity changes. And then, and it depends by brand, obviously, but as communications may continue with the guest prior or leading up to their arrival, that too provides an opportunity to provide more updated information. And then finally, maybe upon registration, whether a client is still using a registration card, whether the registration be done electronically, or frankly, in some instances, whether a separate acknowledgement or notice is provided upon check-in, that too might provide an opportunity. The only concern I would raise, going back to an earlier point as to what the terms of that booking may be, providing notice upon registration may be too late to the extent you wish to actually enforce those and actually hold the guest accountable. It becomes increasingly difficult to do that the later you provide the information. Next slide. So some additional areas of concern. And again, the exercise here is simply looking at all of the various touch points between the hotel, the resort, the restaurant, airline, whatever it may be, and the guest or traveler. Again, the goal here being that you don't want the guest to be made aware of these things literally upon arrival. When they're walking in your front door, you don't want that to be the very first time that you've posted a sign talking about your practices and policies and amenity changes. That should not be the first time that that is communicated. What we're seeing most clients do with regard to these other communications, they tend to fall into one of two camps. One is they simply take whatever existing signage or whatever contract language or whatever waiver or disclaimer they may already be using, and they simply build in a reference or two to pandemic, epidemics, contracting of illness or disease or what have you, among the long list of other conditions or other instances or circumstances they have already started talking about. And you see that a lot in a guest waiver, for example, or disclaimer about the usage of a gym or a spa treatment. The other camp tends to be more focused on the pandemic, and that is rather than simply adding pandemic to the list of other circumstances, there's actually specific language that is written that talks about, in addition to all of these other things that might occur or these other circumstances you should be aware of, guest, please note that because of your activity or stay or participation, it does present a risk of contracting COVID. And as a result of that, you need to do X, Y, and Z. No surprise here on the list, on property signage, whether that be upon arrival, whether that be entering into a particular portion or area of the property, for example, the gym, many opportunities for guest signage. Guest waivers and disclaimers, we're going to talk in a minute about waivers and hold harmless generally, but there are many opportunities where even putting aside the issue of, do I want a general disclaimer with regard to COVID, there are many areas or activities at most properties that already employ some form of disclaimer. So again, common list here, gym usage, participation in particular activities or access or use of equipment, whether it be at a beachside resort, whether it be bicycles, whether it be in-room workout equipment, whatever it may be. Childcare is another area that we have focused a lot on to those properties that provide some form of childcare or child program. We typically recommend talking a bit about COVID exposure there. And then obviously spa. Spa is a little unique because so many spas today already have extensive questionnaires, extensive disclaimers. It's quite easy there to include references and talk about COVID in a meaningful way that doesn't necessarily strike the guest as something to be particularly concerned about. Next category here, guest contracts, and this is largely in the hotel, resort, conference center perspective. As my colleague, I think Ruth Walters, who was also presenting at this year's conference, will talk a bit more about, we're seeing a lot of requests from groups, corporate booking agreements, group travel, leisure contracts, et cetera, no surprise, a lot of these groups are asking for particular language on COVID, talking about what health and safety protocols the property has adopted, asking for evidence of that type of thing, not too different than what we saw following 9/11 and the understandable concern about security and what practices a property or brand or facility might have adopted around security. We're seeing now the same thing as it relates to guest health and security. And then finally, third-party distribution channels. We talked a bit about in the prior slide of online booking path. Keep in mind that it's important that when communicating these changes or practices or policies or what have you, there are a lot of various touch points now where bookings and reservations and those things are made. And it's important to try to communicate these things through each of those channels. I know for a fact that some of the more traditional, larger booking channels, OTAs, et cetera, are now allowing properties to provide some information around their COVID response. I would encourage everyone to make sure they use that opportunity. If the distribution channel or point that you're using does not provide a formal mechanism, our recommendation has been to reach out to those channels, make clear to those channels what policies or practices have been adopted, and ask for an opportunity or ask for assurances that those will be communicated to guests prior to booking in a meaningful manner. Next slide. So the big question that we received very early on and often related to hold harmless and waivers. And before talking about this in a ton of detail, which frankly we could probably spend all morning or afternoon walking through this, there's a couple of things to recognize. First, there is a growing number of states today that have, in response to the pandemic, passed some kind of state legislation or regulatory relief around civil liability associated with the pandemic. Though that legislation has been very different from state to state, today, based on my last review, which was some time ago, several weeks ago, Louisiana and North Carolina were the only two states to talk specifically about the hospitality industry, in both instances focusing on restaurants, event planners. There are some states that have adopted sort of broad premises liability immunities, those being Iowa, Utah, and Arkansas. I know for a fact that this continues to be debated in many states, whether this is necessary. And then obviously in the second round of federal stimulus, should it ever be adopted, there has been much discussion about, as part of the federal stimulus, whether or not it should also include some kind of civil immunity for pandemic-related harms. Putting that aside for a moment and putting aside the general question about many states' limitation or refusal to even recognize and enforce hold harmless agreements, the question is should you use one? And it's interesting because early on when we were asked this question, again, going back to the balancing act that we're trying to strike, so many of our clients were adopting and promoting their stay safety or stay healthy programs related to practices and policies being adopted, efforts to provide ultra clean facilities, whatever it may be. And again, consistent with their brand, they were building this into the overall brand experience or brand proposition. And so while on the one hand, we're promoting ourselves as being a really safe and clean place to stay, what message does it send if part of that stay or prior to that stay, we ask our guests to sign some kind of hold harmless or waiver? Those very early discussions with brands often ended up with the decision not to require one, not to implement that. That has changed a little bit over time as some large ownership groups have come back around and said, yes, we want waivers to be put in place. What we're seeing generally is, and that is as of today, and obviously could change, is that for most large operators, whether it be branded or not, most have not yet adopted broad waivers, meaning a waiver that is required for a stay at the hotel or a use of a restaurant, what have you. What we are finding is limited instances where there are to hold harmless and waivers being sought, whether it be for particular activities, as I mentioned before, access and use of spa treatments or what have you, that in instances or areas where a disclaimer is something that's been used historically, that it's okay to amend that disclaimer or to describe in that disclaimer the pandemic and contracting the pandemic, or in this case, the virus. That kind of change is typically felt to be okay, when in fact others don't want the broader type of disclaimer. So again, it's a balancing act that every company that we work with is going through. Next slide. So I think as my time here comes to an end, there's sort of three things that I would encourage all of you to keep in mind, and would welcome the opportunity to talk all of you a bit more about at the roundtable. And that is what guests' expectations are, what they're demanding of communications, expectations or hopes being, if I stay or if I eat or if I travel with you, you're going to provide me the safest and healthiest environment possible. And as I said at the outset, it's going to be terribly important that we get that message to guests and travelers in one way or another before they begin traveling again. At the same time, though, hoteliers have an obligation, and frankly, it makes good business to communicate often on these issues, but at the same time being cognizant of the legal effects of doing that and doing so correctly, the benefits of that. And then the finally takeaway is this incredible balancing act. And this isn't unique, obviously, to COVID communications. That's part of our role as attorneys, frankly, all the time, is to help our clients strike those balances. But there is definitely, and I see it daily in questions from clients about at what point do we get so far that we do need the disclaimer, or at what point do we get so far that we do need to change our notice in a particular way. That delicate balancing act occurs frequently. With that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. Again, a huge thanks to Taylor and Stephen and the entire team, and a huge thanks to you all for tuning in and participating in this year's conference. Thank you.
Greg, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic as usual. We are so looking forward to your deeper dive roundtable.